Snowflakes fell gently across the bustling streets of Toronto on Christmas Eve, blanketing the city in a crisp white glow. Rows of houses were adorned with colorful lights that twinkled like tiny stars, their reflections dancing in puddles of melted snow. Lampposts wrapped in red ribbons and wreaths stood as festive sentinels, while carolers in the distance sang in soft harmony. The sounds of laughter, the smell of freshly baked cookies, and the rhythmic clang of church bells painted a perfect holiday scene. In a modest little house at the corner of Maple Lane, the Hernandez family gathered around a patchy Christmas tree that still managed to exude warmth and charm. The soft hum of a space heater filled the room as a single strand of lights blinked hesitantly on the tree. The Hernandez family had always been big on Christmas spirit, even if life didn't always grant them the luxury of a lavish celebration. This year had been especially tough. Maria, the mother of 2 young children, had been working extra shifts as a waitress since her husband, Luis, was laid off 3 months prior. Luis, a proud but gentle man, had been doing odd jobs here and there, but money remained tight. For the first time, Maria worried her kids, 10-year-old Sofia and 6-year-old Mateo, might not have the Christmas they deserved. "Mom, is Santa still coming?" Mateo asked, his brown eyes wide with concern as he poked at a cookie they'd made from leftover baking supplies. "Of course he is, sweetheart," Maria said softly, brushing her son's dark hair back as her voice wavered. "Santa never forgets good kids like you and Sofia." Luis, overhearing, smiled faintly from across the room as he pretended to fix an old clock. He shared a quiet glance with Maria, the kind of glance that said, "I wish things were different." But Sofia, sharp for her age, caught on. "It's okay, Mama," she whispered later, hugging her mother's side. "I don't need presents this year. We have each other." Maria kissed the top of her daughter's head, feeling her throat tighten. She promised herself she'd make the day special, no matter what it took. By early evening, the family had bundled up to make their annual trip downtown to see the Christmas lights. They might not have gifts this year, but the Hernandez family still held tight to their traditions. As they walked hand in hand through the city streets, Sofia and Mateo marveled at the glowing reindeer displays and giant candy canes that towered above. "Look, Mateo!" Sofia exclaimed, pointing toward an enormous Christmas tree in the middle of the square. "It's taller than our house." Luis smiled, a little of his burden lifting as he watched his children's excitement. For a moment, things felt normal. But then, disaster struck. Mateo's mitten slipped off as he darted toward the glowing tree, and in a tragic instant, his tiny figure collided with a slick patch of ice. He tumbled forward, scraping his knee and bursting into tears. "Mateo!" Maria cried, rushing toward him as Luis knelt beside their son. Sofia hovered anxiously as a small crowd began to gather, all concerned but unsure how to help. Suddenly, a deep but gentle voice broke through the murmurs. "Is he okay? Here, let me help." Maria looked up and froze. Standing before her, dressed in a simple black coat and scarf, was none other than Keanu Reeves. At first, Maria thought her tired mind must be playing tricks on her, but the kind smile and unmistakable face left no room for doubt. Keanu crouched down beside Mateo, who had stopped crying out of pure shock. "Hey, little buddy," Keanu said warmly, pulling a clean handkerchief from his pocket. "Looks like you had a tough fall." Mateo sniffled and nodded as Keanu carefully wiped the scrape on his knee. "You're a brave kid," Keanu said, his voice soft yet reassuring. "Don't worry, a small scrape like this can't stop someone as strong as you, right?" Mateo, still wide-eyed, managed a small nod. You're John Wick," he whispered in awe. Keanu chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "Sometimes, yeah. But right now, I'm just your friend." Maria, still stunned, found her voice. "Thank you, so much," she said softly. "You didn't have to." "It's Christmas Eve," Keanu interrupted kindly, turning to smile at her. "This is what Christmas is all about, isn't it? Helping each other. Keanu glanced down at Mateo's torn mitten and frowned. Wait here, he said before darting into the nearby crowd. The Hernandez family exchanged looks, their breath visible in the cold air. Sophia's eyes were practically sparkling as she whispered to her mom, "Is that really him?" Moments later, Keanu returned, holding a fresh set of warm mittens and a small teddy bear he'd purchased from a nearby vendor. He knelt down and handed them to Mateo, whose face lit up like the Christmas tree. "Here you go, champ." "Merry Christmas," Keanu said softly. Mateo hugged the bear tightly, his earlier tears forgotten. "Thank you, Mr. Wick." Keanu laughed and stood up, turning to Luis and Maria. "Your family is incredible. Don't let this little bump ruin the night." Luis extended his hand, still overwhelmed. "You have no idea what this means to us, sir." "Thank you." Keanu shook Luis' hand firmly, his eyes kind. "I'm just glad I was here." He paused, looking at the family with a thoughtful expression. "Where are you headed now?" "Home," Maria replied, shrugging with a faint smile. "We were just trying to make the most of the day." Keanu grinned and gestured toward a nearby cafe. "How about I treat you all to some hot chocolate first? It's freezing out here." The Hernandez family sat quietly in a cozy corner of the cafe Keanu had brought them to. The place smelled of cinnamon, coffee, and freshly baked pastries, a comforting contrast to the biting cold outside. Warm golden lights hung from the rafters, and a soft rendition of Silent Night played over the speakers. Maria wrapped her hands around a steaming mug of hot chocolate, feeling the warmth seep through her fingers. Mateo and Sophia sat beside her, their faces alight with wonder. Both sipped their drinks, the whipped cream leaving faint mustaches on their lips, which made Keanu chuckle warmly. Luis, still reeling from their chance encounter, leaned in toward Keanu. "You know, my kids will never forget this moment. You've given them a story they'll tell for the rest of their lives." Keanu smiled, a modest shrug lifting his shoulders. "The small moments are often the ones that matter most," he said. "Christmas has a way of reminding us about that." Just as Maria began to feel the tension of the day melt away, the chime of the cafe door startled her. A sharp gust of wind blew through as the door swung open, and a man in his late 50s stomped inside, muttering under his breath. He wore a tattered coat and carried a worn backpack slung over one shoulder. His hair was disheveled, and his face bore the lines of years spent braving hard winters. The man shuffled past the counter and lowered himself into a corner booth, away from everyone. He seemed to shrink into himself, his eyes darting cautiously around the room as though expecting judgment or trouble. People at nearby tables shot him sidelong glances, whispering to one another. The festive mood dimmed just a little. Maria noticed the man's trembling hands as he tried to pull something from his pocket. Her heart ached. She'd seen enough hardship this year to recognize someone struggling to hold it all together. "Poor man," she whispered to Luis. "It's too cold for him to be out there alone." Luis nodded solemnly but stayed quiet, unsure of what to do. At that moment, Mateo and Sophia, their young eyes unburdened by the cynicism of the world, watched the man curiously. "Why is he sad, Mama?" Sophia asked softly. "Maybe he needs hot chocolate too," Mateo added, clutching his teddy bear tightly. Keanu had been listening quietly, his gaze lingering on the man in the corner. His face, so calm and kind, grew thoughtful. Maria noticed and whispered, "You don't have to do anything. You've already done so much for us." But Keanu shook his head gently. "Sometimes Christmas doesn't just bring us joy, it gives us a chance to share it." He stood up, grabbed his coat from the back of his chair, and approached the man, carrying the easy confidence of someone who genuinely cared. The cafe hushed as all eyes followed Keanu's every move. "Mind if I sit here?" Keanu asked politely when he reached the man's table. The man looked up, startled. His eyes, weary and guarded, squinted in disbelief. You're," he stammered. just Keanu, Keanu said with a small smile. You look like you could use something warm. The man hesitated, as though unsure whether this was a cruel joke. Finally, he gave a small nod, his shoulders still tense. Keanu signaled the barista and ordered a hot chocolate, along with a sandwich. What's your name? Keanu asked softly, sitting across from him. The man swallowed hard. Frank, he said hoarsely. I'm just passing through. Keanu nodded, offering no judgment. Well, Frank, it's Christmas Eve. No one should spend it alone or hungry. From across the cafe, Maria felt tears sting her eyes. Her own struggles had made her acutely aware of how easy it was to fall through the cracks. She watched as Keanu leaned forward, speaking softly to Frank. Whatever he said seemed to lift the weight off the man's shoulders, if only for a moment. The cafe buzzed softly again, but now it was different. A few people who had shot Frank wary looks earlier seemed to soften. One woman approached the counter and quietly paid for Frank's meal. Another man, clearly inspired by what he'd witnessed, left a large tip for the barista, who smiled in surprise. Luis turned to Maria, his voice low but filled with emotion. You know, I think Keanu's right. Christmas isn't about what you don't have. It's about sharing what you do. Maria nodded, squeezing his hand. And sometimes it takes someone extraordinary to remind us of that. As Keanu returned to their table, Frank now sipping his hot chocolate with visible relief, Sophia beamed up at him. You helped him too, she said proudly. Keanu smiled, ruffling Mateo's hair. Christmas magic spreads further than you think. It just takes a little kindness to keep it going. Outside the cafe, the snow continued to fall, but somehow, the world felt just a little bit warmer. The cafe seemed warmer than before, though the storm outside had worsened. Large snowflakes drifted from the dark sky, swirling in sharp gusts of wind that rattled the windows. Frank, the older man in the corner booth, sipped his hot chocolate quietly, his trembling hands finally steadying. The Hernandez family sat watching Keanu Reeves with a mix of awe and quiet gratitude. Yet, despite the momentary calm, a strange tension lingered in the air. As Keanu returned to his table with the Hernandez family, Maria leaned in, her voice low. That was such a kind thing to do for him. But, what if he's dangerous? Luis gave her a disapproving look. Maria. I'm not saying he is, she replied quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. I just worry. The world hasn't exactly been kind to us this year. I don't want the kids getting too close to someone we don't know. Sophia, who had been listening, frowned. Mama, he's just cold. He looked so sad before Mr. Keanu helped him. Maria sighed and brushed a hand over Sophia's hair, feeling ashamed of her own hesitation. She wanted to believe the best in people, especially on Christmas Eve, but life had made her cautious. Keanu, overhearing, offered her a reassuring smile. You're a good mother, he said softly. It's natural to protect your family. But sometimes, we miss out on seeing the best in people because we're afraid of the worst. Maria bit her lip, feeling a pang of guilt. Before she could respond, the door to the cafe slammed open once again with a loud thud, startling everyone. A group of young men, 4 of them, burst into the cafe, stomping snow from their boots and laughing loudly. Their presence seemed to shift the room's energy in an instant. They were rowdy, their voices carrying over the soft Christmas music. The leader of the group, a tall man in a worn leather jacket, took off his beanie and slapped it against his leg to shake off the snow. His eyes scanned the room casually before landing on Frank, who was still sitting alone, his head lowered. Hey, look who it is, the man called out, his tone mocking. Frank the Tank. Didn't expect to see you in here. Frank flinched at the sound of his name. The cafe went still. Keanu's expression darkened ever so slightly, though he remained calm. Luis and Maria exchanged nervous glances, instinctively pulling Sophia and Matteo a little closer. "Leave him alone," Keanu said gently, his voice carrying just enough weight to silence the laughter. "It's Christmas Eve." The man turned, surprised to see who had spoken. He squinted, realization dawning across his face. "Whoa. No way. Are you Keanu Reeves?" The group murmured excitedly, a mix of disbelief and awe breaking their cocky demeanor. "Dude, it's him," one of the younger men whispered. Keanu nodded, giving them a small smile. "Yeah. I'm Keanu. And I'm asking you to let him be. He's not bothering anyone." For a brief moment, it seemed like the group might back down. But the man in the leather jacket wasn't so easily swayed. He turned back to Frank with a sneer. "Just making sure Frank here knows he's not welcome," he said. "He's been camping out near our shop, begging for change. Ruins business. We're just doing what no one else will." At this, Luis stood, his voice calm but firm. "It's Christmas. You don't treat people like that, no matter who they are." The leader scoffed. "And who are you, huh?" Tension crackled in the air. The warm glow of the Christmas lights seemed out of place against the building hostility. Frank sat frozen, clearly humiliated. Sophia and Matteo clung to Maria, their eyes wide as they sensed the rising conflict. Keanu stood again, his tall frame casting a shadow over the table. Though his posture was relaxed, his presence alone was enough to quiet the room once more. "Everyone has their struggles," Keanu said evenly, his voice low but steady. "It costs nothing to show kindness. And on a night like this, it matters more than ever." The man's face twisted, torn between his pride and the strange power of Keanu's words. One of his friends tugged at his sleeve. "Come on, man. Let's go. You're embarrassing yourself." Finally, the leader relented, shaking his head in frustration. "Whatever," he muttered. "Let's get out of here." As quickly as they had arrived, the group left, their boots crunching loudly on the snow outside. The door slammed shut, and the cafe was quiet once more, save for the faint sound of "O Holy Night" playing softly in the background. Frank's eyes stayed fixed on the table in front of him, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Maria's heart softened as she watched him shrink into himself, a man who'd been pushed down so many times he'd forgotten how to stand tall. Keanu sat back down, his expression calm but thoughtful. "You okay, Frank?" he asked gently. Frank nodded but didn't look up. "You didn't have to do that," he muttered. "They're right. I don't belong here." "Don't say that," Sophia blurted suddenly, surprising everyone. "You belong here. It's Christmas, and everyone belongs." Frank finally looked up, his eyes red and watery. Keanu smiled softly, gesturing to the cozy cafe around them. "She's right, you know. No one gets left out on Christmas. Not tonight." Maria, feeling ashamed of her earlier doubt, spoke up. "You're welcome to sit with us, Frank. If you'd like." Frank blinked, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden warmth being offered to him. For the first time that night, his shoulders seemed to relax. "Thank you," he said hoarsely, his voice barely above a whisper. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a quiet stillness. Inside, the cafe felt brighter. The tension had lifted, replaced by something fragile yet profound, a shared understanding that Christmas wasn't about perfection, but about opening your heart, especially to those who needed it most. And though the Hernandez family had arrived with their own struggles, they now saw the night differently. Through the simple kindness of one man, they were reminded of what the holiday was truly about. The cafe, though now quieter, still hummed with an odd mix of emotions. Maria watched Frank slowly move from his corner booth to sit beside their family, his presence at first awkward but softening as Sophia handed him one of her untouched gingerbread cookies. The little girl beamed at him, her face radiant with the kind of kindness only children possess. You can have this, she said simply. It's really yummy. Frank blinked in surprise, looking down at the cookie. He turned it over in his hands, almost reverently, as if it were the first act of generosity he'd been shown in years. For a moment, he couldn't find his voice. Thank you, he said finally, his tone barely audible. You're a very sweet girl. Sophia grinned. It's Christmas. Everyone needs a cookie at Christmas. Keanu chuckled softly, clearly moved by the moment, and gently added, she's right. Everyone deserves something good tonight. Maria exchanged a glance with Luis, her earlier wariness toward Frank dissipating like the steam rising from their mugs. There was something profound in the way Keanu had treated Frank, as if he were no different from anyone else. A man with struggles, yes, but also a man deserving of dignity. Outside, the snow continued to fall harder, piling thickly on the cobbled streets. The few patrons remaining in the cafe spoke in hushed voices, stealing glances at Keanu, at Frank, and at the little family that had unknowingly become the center of this unusual Christmas Eve story. And then the door jingled again. This time, it wasn't another group of rowdy men. Instead, a young woman entered, carrying an air of frantic urgency. She was dressed in an oversized coat and a knitted scarf that half covered her face. As she stomped the snow from her boots, her wide eyes darted across the cafe. They landed on Frank, and she froze. Dad? The room went still. Frank turned sharply, his brow furrowed. Lydia, he rasped, his voice full of disbelief. The young woman's eyes filled with tears as she crossed the cafe in a few steps. Dad, I've been looking everywhere for you. Maria instinctively hugged Sophia closer as she watched the moment unfold. Frank looked utterly shocked, his hands trembling slightly as Lydia fell to her knees in front of him, gripping his weathered hands in her own. I thought you were gone, she whispered, her voice breaking. I've been so worried. Frank blinked, his face crumpling as though the weight of his hardships had just been lifted all at once. Lydia. I didn't think you'd want to see me, he admitted hoarsely. Not after everything. Lydia shook her head fiercely, tears slipping down her cheeks. Don't you understand? You're my father. I've been trying to find you since you left. Her voice wavered. It's Christmas, Dad. Please come home. The cafe held its collective breath. Even Sophia and Matteo sat frozen, their wide eyes flicking between Frank and Lydia. I don't have much left to give, sweetheart, Frank muttered, his voice heavy with shame. I lost everything. You're wrong, Lydia replied, her voice soft but full of conviction. You're here. That's enough. That's all that ever mattered to me. Maria felt tears sting her eyes. She hadn't expected this raw, beautiful moment of love and forgiveness between father and daughter. Luis reached for her hand under the table, giving it a small squeeze. Across from them, Keanu smiled faintly, his eyes glistening as he watched Frank and Lydia. It was as though he'd known all along that something like this could happen, that the universe had conspired to bring this family back together on Christmas Eve. Frank's shoulders finally slumped as if releasing years of regret. His hands, still trembling, gripped Lydia's tightly. You came for me? I never stopped looking, she replied, smiling through her tears. The cafe erupted into a hushed, emotional warmth. One of the baristas discreetly wiped her eyes with a napkin, while the older gentleman at the far table nodded in silent approval, a small smile on his lips. Lydia stood and helped Frank to his feet. For the first time all night, Frank looked taller, as though he'd found a piece of himself he thought he'd lost forever. As Frank and Lydia turned to leave, Frank paused by Keanu's table. He looked at the actor, his expression full of quiet gratitude. I don't know how to thank you, he said softly. You didn't have to help me. Keanu shook his head, his smile kind. It wasn't me, Frank. Sometimes all we need is a little hope to remind us where we belong. Frank nodded and turned to Maria, Luis, and the kids. Thank you for sharing your table with an old man like me. Maria, tears glistening in her eyes, smiled warmly. Merry Christmas, Frank. I hope you find everything you're looking for. He glanced at Lydia, standing patiently at the door, and smiled. I think I already have. As Frank and Lydia disappeared into the snowstorm outside, the cafe seemed brighter, as though the Christmas lights now glowed with an extra sparkle. Luis exhaled, his voice quiet but full of wonder. Did that really just happen? Maria nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. It did. Sophia clapped her hands suddenly, her voice full of excitement. It's like magic. Christmas magic. Keanu chuckled softly. She's not wrong. The Hernandez family sat there for a moment, letting the emotions of the evening settle over them like a warm blanket. Despite their own struggles, they'd witnessed something extraordinary, a small miracle born from kindness, love, and forgiveness. Maria looked at Keanu, her heart full. Thank you, she said. For everything tonight. Keanu shook his head. Don't thank me. Christmas has a way of giving us exactly what we need, even when we don't expect it. Outside, the snow fell gently now, as though the world itself had softened. Inside the cafe, the Christmas spirit burned bright, a reminder to all that love, kindness, and forgiveness can bring miracles, even in the most unexpected places. And so, on a snowy Christmas Eve, two families found hope, and one act of kindness brought a man back home. The snow had finally slowed to a gentle fall, drifting peacefully outside the cafe window. Inside, the warm glow of the lights reflected off Maria's face as she sat in quiet contemplation. It had been an extraordinary night, one that started with doubt and fatigue but ended with a sense of wonder she hadn't felt in years. Her gaze fell on Sophia and Mateo, who were now busy decorating a gingerbread house at the table, their giggles carrying softly through the room. They were oblivious to the weight of what had transpired, but their innocent joy only deepened Maria's gratitude. Luis caught her thoughtful expression and smiled softly. What are you thinking about? He asked, his voice low. Maria turned toward him, shaking her head slightly. About tonight. About Frank, and Lydia, and us. Luis leaned back in his chair, nodding. I know what you mean. It feels like, we were meant to be here tonight. Like we were part of something bigger. Maria's lips curled into a faint smile as she glanced over at Keanu, who sat quietly sipping his coffee, looking perfectly at ease. How strange life was, she thought. They'd walked into this cafe burdened by their own worries, bills, a worn-out car, and the looming uncertainty of the new year. Yet none of that felt as heavy now. For so long, Maria had been afraid of trusting strangers, of believing in miracles, of hoping for things she couldn't control. But tonight, seeing Keanu's selflessness, Frank's reunion with his daughter, and her own children's effortless ability to give love, something inside her shifted. Luis, she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. I was wrong earlier. Luis looked at her, confused. Wrong? When Frank came over, when I doubted him, Maria admitted softly. I let my fears blind me. I was so focused on keeping us safe that I almost forgot what it means to open your heart to others. I didn't want to see him. Not really. I was so used to believing the worst in people. Luis squeezed her hand gently. You were protecting us, Maria. That's not a bad thing. I know, Maria replied. But tonight reminded me that kindness isn't weakness. It's what makes us strong. I don't want to teach our kids to be afraid of the world. I want to teach them to make it better, like Keanu did tonight. Luis nodded, his face full of understanding. Then maybe tonight wasn't just for Frank. Maybe it was for us, too. Across the table, Keanu seemed lost in his own thoughts, the soft hum of the cafe filling the silence. He had seen the same story unfold countless times, people at their breaking point, carrying burdens unseen by others. And yet, every time, he was reminded of the power of showing up. The small smile that played on his lips wasn't one of pride, but of quiet relief. He hadn't saved Frank tonight, he'd only offered a hand when it was needed. Frank, Lydia, and the Hernandez family had saved each other. As if sensing Maria's gaze, Keanu looked up and met her eyes. She smiled, this time free of hesitation or doubt. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You showed us more than you know." Keanu gave her a gentle nod, his eyes kind. Sometimes all it takes is seeing one act of kindness to remember what we're capable of. That's what Christmas is about. When Sophia finished decorating her gingerbread house, she clapped her hands together excitedly. "Look, Mama. It's for Mr. Frank." Maria blinked, surprised. "For Frank?" Sophia nodded enthusiastically. "You said everyone deserves something nice on Christmas. Can we give it to him?" Maria felt tears sting her eyes again, this time from pure pride. She crouched next to her daughter, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're absolutely right, sweetheart. That's a beautiful thing to do." In that moment, Maria knew that the events of the night had changed her family forever. Luis, too, seemed lighter as he ruffled Mateo's hair and smiled at Sophia. Their struggles hadn't disappeared, but they no longer felt insurmountable. Instead, they felt like a family stronger for what they'd seen, proof that kindness could turn strangers into friends, and that hope could find its way through even the heaviest snowstorm. As the Hernandez family prepared to leave, they paused by Keanu's table. Luis extended his hand. "I don't know if you'll ever know how much tonight meant to us," he said. "But we won't forget it." Keanu shook Luis's hand, his smile warm. "Neither will I." Sophia tugged on Keanu's sleeve, holding up the small gingerbread house. "Can you give this to Mr. Frank when you see him again? I hope he likes it." Keanu crouched to her level, taking the gingerbread house carefully. "I promise I'll make sure he gets it," he said softly. "You have a very big heart." As the family stepped back out into the snowy night, Maria felt something new settle over her, peace. She looked up at the quiet sky, snowflakes melting on her cheeks, and whispered, "Thank you." Because, for the first time in a long time, she truly believed that miracles could happen. The cafe remained a warm haven against the cold night outside, but something about its atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't just the snowstorm that had softened, the hearts of everyone inside seemed to glow a little brighter. Kindness, like the scent of cinnamon and coffee lingering in the air, had settled into every corner. For the Hernandez family, Frank, Lydia, and even Keanu, the events of this Christmas Eve had already created ripples of change. What they didn't realize was how far those ripples would travel, how one evening of kindness would touch not only their lives but the lives of everyone who had witnessed it. At the back of the cafe, Claire, one of the young baristas, leaned against the counter with a small smile playing on her lips. Earlier, she had watched Frank enter, tired, disheveled, and ignored. For a moment, she had judged him, much like everyone else. But Keanu's quiet compassion had struck something deep within her. That was incredible, she whispered to her coworker, Jason, who was wiping down the counter. Jason nodded, his movements slow and thoughtful. "I know. I almost didn't want to serve the guy at first. Thought he was just trouble." He shook his head, a tinge of shame in his voice. "But look what happened. I mean, his daughter found him." Claire smiled faintly, her gaze distant. "It makes you think, doesn't it? How many people do we walk past every day and never give a second thought to? What if they just need someone to see them?" Jason paused, setting down the cloth. "Maybe next time, we won't look away." The two exchanged a knowing glance before Claire turned back to the cafe, where Keanu sat alone, his presence quiet yet unmistakable. She made a silent promise to herself, to treat people with more kindness, to look for the humanity in others even when it wasn't immediately visible. At the far corner of the cafe sat an older man with a weathered face and a wool coat. He had been quietly observing everything: Frank's hesitation, Lydia's tearful reunion, and the Hernandez family's transformation. He finished his coffee slowly, lost in thought. Years ago, he had been in Frank's shoes, a man who had pushed away his family and spent Christmases alone. It had taken decades to rebuild those relationships, and yet, tonight reminded him how fragile and powerful human connection could be. Before leaving, the man approached Keanu's table. "I hope you know what you did tonight wasn't small," he said in a gravelly voice. "It was a gift, to all of us." Keanu looked up, a smile spreading across his face. "Sometimes it doesn't take much to remind people they matter." The older man nodded, his voice softer this time. "It's easy to forget. But I won't tonight. Merry Christmas, son." As the Hernandez family walked home through the snow-covered streets, hand in hand, Maria felt lighter than she had in years. Around her, the city sparkled with Christmas lights, but what truly warmed her was the realization that kindness had changed more than just their evening. She glanced at Luis, who smiled at her with quiet gratitude, and then at Sofia and Mateo, who stomped joyfully through the snowdrifts ahead. "Mama!" Sofia called, twirling with her arms stretched wide. "We gave Mr. Frank a gingerbread house, and he got his daughter back. It's like magic." Maria laughed softly, her heart swelling. "It is, isn't it?" In that moment, Maria understood how much her children had learned that night, lessons no amount of gifts could ever replace. They had seen firsthand how compassion could mend broken hearts, how one small act of kindness could create miracles, and how family, whether blood or chosen, was at the heart of everything. When Sofia grew up, Maria thought, maybe she'd remember this night. Maybe she would become someone who offered hope to others, just as Keanu had offered it to Frank. Maybe that gingerbread house, so simple yet so full of meaning, would inspire her to believe in the power of giving. The Hernandez family didn't know it, but their kindness had created a legacy. In the days to come, the cafe staff would share the story of Frank and Lydia with their families. Customers would return, some just to sit at the same table and reflect on that miraculous Christmas Eve. Frank and Lydia's reunion would inspire others to reach out to estranged family members, taking that first, vulnerable step toward forgiveness. And Keanu? For him, the night was just another reminder of why kindness mattered. He didn't act for recognition, but he knew the truth: one small act could change the course of someone's life. As the snow continued to fall across the city, blanketing rooftops and sidewalks in quiet peace, something invisible lingered in the air, a renewed sense of hope, a deeper belief in the goodness of people, and a reminder that miracles often begin with a single choice: to care. This Christmas Eve, in one small cafe, a single act of kindness sparked change, not just for those directly involved, but for everyone who saw it, felt it, and carried it forward into the world. And that, truly, was the greatest gift of all. The snowstorm had grown fierce again, the wind howling like a restless spirit outside the cafe. Inside, the tension was palpable as Frank sat at the table, his hands trembling, eyes darting toward the door. Maria watched him, her heart torn between doubt and hope. "Do you think she'll come?" Frank's voice cracked, breaking the heavy silence. Keanu, sitting across from him, offered a calm, reassuring nod. "She will." Maria glanced at her children, nestled close to Luis. They'd given Frank their gingerbread house earlier, a gesture of pure innocence and love. Somehow, it felt like that small act had been a turning point, a spark of hope in a man who had nearly lost everything. The doorbell jingled, piercing the quiet like a bell in a cathedral. Everyone turned toward the entrance. There she stood, Lydia. Her face was flushed from the cold, and her dark hair tumbled over her coat. Her eyes searched the cafe frantically until they landed on him. "Dad?" Frank froze. For a moment, it was as if time itself held its breath. Tears filled his eyes as he rose from the table on unsteady legs. "Lydia?" His voice was barely a whisper. Maria watched the girl's face soften, torn between hesitation and longing. She saw the years of hurt that had built up inside her, the doubt she had carried into adulthood. But then something changed, a flicker of recognition, a memory of a man who had once been her everything. I wasn't sure I'd come, Lydia said, her voice trembling. I didn't know if you meant it. Frank's face crumpled, his vulnerability laid bare for all to see. I do mean it, Lydia. I've made mistakes, more than I can count, but I never stopped loving you. Not for a second. The cafe grew silent, the only sounds the faint whistle of the wind outside and the crackle of the fireplace. Everyone, Maria, Luis, the kids, the cafe workers, watched this raw, fragile moment unfold. Lydia took a hesitant step forward. Why now, Dad? Why tonight? Frank looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. Because tonight, someone reminded me that it's never too late to fix what's broken. To try, even if I don't deserve it. I can't change the past, but I can fight for a future, if you'll let me. For a long moment, Lydia stared at him, her emotions a storm behind her eyes. Then, slowly, she closed the gap between them. Frank's breath hitched as she wrapped her arms around him. I missed you, Dad, she whispered. Frank choked back a sob, holding his daughter as though afraid she might disappear. I missed you too, baby girl. So much. Across the cafe, Maria felt tears slipping down her cheeks. Luis wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his voice soft. Looks like they got their Christmas miracle. Keanu, quietly watching, smiled faintly to himself. His job was done. The storm outside raged on, but inside, there was only warmth, love, forgiveness, and the quiet hum of hope that miracles still happened, even on the coldest of nights. Resolution. As the night wore on, the storm outside began to subside, leaving the world covered in a blanket of white. Inside the cafe, the warmth of the fire mingled with the soft glow of the Christmas lights, creating an atmosphere of peace that seemed almost surreal after the emotional whirlwind. Lydia and Frank remained seated at the table, hands clasped tightly as they spoke in low tones, their words filled with an unspoken understanding. The years of pain, the distance between them, began to melt away like the snow on the windowpane. There were no more barriers, just two people, rediscovering the bond they had almost lost. Maria watched them from her table, her heart full of quiet joy. Sofia and Mateo were asleep in Luis's arms, their faces peaceful after the excitement of the evening. The gingerbread house had found its way into Frank's hands, the sweet symbol of a new beginning. Keanu, quietly sipping his coffee, caught Maria's eye across the room. She smiled at him, her expression soft and filled with gratitude. She had seen how his small, simple act of kindness had sparked a change in Frank, in Lydia, and in all of them. He hadn't just offered help, he had restored faith in the goodness of people. I never thought I'd see the day, Maria murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Luis, watching the reunion between father and daughter, nodded. It's a Christmas miracle. As the evening came to a close, Frank and Lydia stood up, their conversation winding down but the connection between them stronger than it had ever been. We're going to take it slow, Lydia said, looking at Frank with a mixture of hope and cautious optimism. But I think we can start again. Frank nodded, his voice thick with emotion. I'll do whatever it takes. Maria stood up to leave, placing a gentle hand on Lydia's shoulder. Take care of each other, she said, her voice kind. We will, Lydia replied, a soft smile breaking through. As the Hernandez family stepped out into the now quiet streets, the world seemed a little brighter. The city, blanketed in snow, felt like a fresh start for all of them. They had shared something far more important than gifts or decorations, they had shared love, forgiveness, and the miracle of togetherness. And in the end, Maria realized, that was what Christmas was truly about. Not just the gifts or the lights or the food. It was the moments of kindness that could heal, the connections that could be rekindled, and the belief that no matter how broken the world might seem, there was always the possibility of a new beginning. With a heart full of peace and hope, Maria looked up at the starlit sky. This Christmas had been everything they needed. And more.